Hayden, Garry. Okay, so according to Henry Resnick's article in the Saturday Evening Post, the author speculates whether or not the numbers of people who've read the Lord of the Rings series will one day dwarf the numbers of people who have not. And so decades later, with the success of the Peter Jackson film adaptations, I would say that the numbers of people who have not heard of the Lord of the Rings in some way or another probably dwarf the numbers of people who have not. So, beginning with a biography on J.R.R. Tolkien, I have kind of laid out 4 different chapters in some way or another of the areas leading up to in his life to the publishing of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which I have laid out. So I'm going to illustrate how Tolkien kind of used life experiences and put them into his writing, of course. So to begin with his early life, John was born in South Africa in 1892 to Arthur and Mabel Tolkien. 2 years later, Hilary Tolkien, John's brother, was born. In 1896, Arthur Tolkien, their father, passed away due to rheumatic fever, and Mabel Tolkien eventually brought the 2 boys back home to the rural countryside of England near Birmingham. So that being said, around the time England was becoming very industrial, so John had a mix of this dark industrial kind of landscape near Birmingham, and then also this nice rural English countryside, going out towards Wales along the western side of England. So, in 1904, Mabel Tolkien also passed away from diabetic complications about 2 decades before treatment for insulin was created. And Mabel had converted from the Anglican Church to the Catholic Church and wanted her boys raised Catholic, so she passed the legal guardianship onto a Father Francis Morgan. So, moving on to the next part of his early life. In this picture here you can see Elvish writing, which just says one ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. And at this time, of course, John was looking for escapism and such with the death of his parents and being alone and stuff. So to get away from that, he picked up a affinity for linguistics and drawing, actually. And at the time, at a very young age, he had mastered Latin and Greek, which is very impressive because those were kind of the academic benchmarks at the time, which would kind of, in some way, guarantee that he could get a scholarship into a college like Oxford, which he eventually did. After the death of Mabel, John took refuge in fantastic drawings and whatnot, according to John Mullen's article from 2019. Motherless characters in The Lord of the Rings do appear, such as Sam, Boromir, Faramir, and Frodo, to name a few. Frodo is actually orphaned around the same age that John Tolkien was, around the age of 12. And so, after the passing of his mother, John and his brother moved in with a Miss Faulkner who lodged orphaned Catholic children, which is where he then met Edith Bratt, which would eventually she would become his wife, and the 2 would marry after, or they would get married before he got sent to World War I. But at the time, when they were very young, John developed a good friendship with Edith, and the 2 would talk through windows and talk through windowsills across from each other, and they'd share notes and share secret signals that they had to kind of share food with each other and stuff. And eventually, Father Francis found out about the friendship, and Edith was a Protestant, and she was also 3 years older than John, and so the social stigma would have been on them, and they would not be able to, love each other until 3 years later. Father Francis forbade John to speak to Edith for about 3 years till he turned 21, so that he could focus on his studies to get into Oxford, because if he did not do that, he would have been working class and we would have never gotten a J.R.R. Tolkien. So, of course, John just continued to study after the loss of Edith, and he eventually did get into Oxford on a scholarship, which is very impressive for a kid who comes from essentially nothing. So the next part of his romantic life that I'd like to talk about, I'm speaking more romantic on the outlook of life, not the outlook of love, but the archaic romantic in a way. So John had this great sense for nature, and that can be seen throughout his books, such as through enchanted forests and such, and wizards who were very connected with nature and things like that. So in 1911, John took a vacation with his friends following high school graduation through the Swiss Alps. They went on a hiking trip, and in the two pictures here you can see this is a little village in Switzerland, and this is Rivendell. Some of the architecture is similar. Of course, Rivendell is a little exaggerated and whatnot, but the scenery was very similar. And John claimed that the scenery of Switzerland was very influential to him. And he also bought a painting while he was in Switzerland called The Mountain Spirit, which he then based Gandalf off of Gandalf the Wizard. So after returning, then he continued to study at Oxford and chose to study classic Latin and Greek literature, philosophy, and a little bit of classical history, which is very impressive. Tough stuff to do. So soon after, of course, that was 1911, the last date I had up there. And the next world event to follow was World War I, and John was no exception. He was also deployed in the war. And after turning 21, he reconnected with Edith before he went to war, and the two threw together kind of a very last-minute wedding. And then John was sent out in 1915, where he reported for duty in France. He fought for about 4 months, but was never really in first-hand combat, but he did have a place in some of the early dealings of the war. So he saw this great, vast destruction, and he carried on to bring that destruction to Mordor and things like that. After arriving in France, he eventually contracted trench fever and was sent back to England, where he then continues to study, and he finished out his time at Oxford. And Tolkien gets a job with the Oxford Dictionary. He actually wrote the definitions for a couple of different words at the time. And in Resnick's article right here, he again highlights that languages were brewing in Tolkien because he wrote these languages for fun, actually when he was a kid, and again when he was an adult recovering from his trench fever in the hospital, which is where he started to write The Hobbit, and actually the first parts of the Silmarillion, it's very hard to pronounce, which is like the very earliest precursors to the Middle-earth's mythology. So he created this mythology trying to make a British mythology because he didn't really think that there was an English mythology. There was a Greek and a Roman mythology, Celtic, Scandinavian, whatnot. And how am I doing on time?
Good.
9.
Okay. So then concluding with the 4 chapters once again, early life, a romantic, no man's land, and academia and career. It's very important that we're still talking about Tolkien, and the fiction that he wrote is still significant because we're still talking about him today. And for example, the HBO is planning a up-and-coming series adaptation of The Lord of the Rings and some of the stories from the Silmarillion. So that is the future of The Lord of the Rings, and that is the fantastic life of J.R.R. Tolkien. And that is all. Thank you.